Alright, so I did say I was gonna make videos about Margaret Sanger, and I said some random thing that she wasn't a eugenicist, but obviously she was because she was in that environment. You know, the Planned Parenthood Federation of America was obviously around in a time when eugenics was pretty much at its peak. Um, there are debates on whether or not it was kind of sketchy and secretive that there was a eugenics sort of demographic play because Margaret and the some of the co-workers, they brought in black workers and people like Webb Du Bois to work for them at Planned Parenthood, and I thought that was pretty cool. Um, there was a lot of black representation in old school Planned Parenthood, despite debatably its complete genocidal framework at the time. You know, it was literally called the Negro Project. Like, how sketchy can you get if it wasn't for black workers and well-known black advocates working there, and Martin Luther King being like giving it having it in good praise. Like, if it wasn't for that, there wouldn't be this much debate. It would be outright genocide. It would be outright ridiculously racist. Um, but overall, she is kind of a eugenicist in a way. There are things that she said, and there are misquotes, but I'm not going to get into that right now. Anyways, Margaret Hoggins Sanger, born September 14th, 1879, September 6th, 1966, also known as Margaret Sanger Slee, was an American birth control activist, sex educator, writer, and nurse. Sanger popularized the term birth control, opened the first birth control clinic in the United States, and established organizations that involved the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. Sanger used her writings and speeches primarily to promote her way of thinking. Prosecuted she was prosecuted for her book Family Planning, Family Limitation under the Comstock stock in 1914. She feared the consequences of her writings, so she fled to Britain until public opinion had quieted. Sanger's efforts to Sanger's efforts contributed to several judicial cases that helped legalize contraception in the United States. Due to her connection with Planned Parenthood, Sanger is frequently criticized by opponents of abortion. Sanger drew a sharp distinction between birth control and abortion, and was opposed to abortions throughout the bulk of her professional career, declining in declining to participate in them as a nurse. Sanger remains an admired figure in the American reproductive rights movement. She has been criticized for supporting negative eugenics. Sanger opposed eugenics along racial lines and did not believe that poverty was hereditary. However, she would appeal to both ideals as a rhetorical tool. Um, yeah, she was very class reductionist, even though she didn't believe in the racial component for for the reason to, you know, anyways, e- based on the caste system and our, even as wealth and health and education gaps close, other people are still looking up at who had first control over the system, and um, there's still always going to be inequalities, regardless of the band aids we try to put over the misuses over wealth and health. So, right, I do believe in one of the things that she wrote. The pivot of civilization, she actually her advocacy for abortion didn't include rich people having more babies. It was actually a neutral playing field of like, you know, um, it wasn't advocating for the majority to have more babies. So I thought that was interesting, even though her rhetoric was still eugenic, which I don't want to talk about right now because I'm just here to read the wiki at the moment. All right. In 1916, Sanger opened the first birth control clinic in the U.S., which led to her arrest for distributing information on contraception. After an undercover policewoman brought a copy of her pamphlet on family planning, her subsequent trial and appeal generated controversy. Sanger felt that for women to have a more equal footing in society and to lead healthier lives, they needed to be able to determine when to bear children. She also she also wanted to prevent so-called back alley abortions, which were common at the time because abortions were illegal in the U.S. She believed that while abortion may be a viable abortion option in life-threatening situations for the pregnant, it should be generally avoided. She considered contraception the only practical way to avoid them. All right. In 1911, after a fire destroyed their home in Hastings on Hudson, the Sangers abandoned the suburbs for a new life in New York City. Sanger worked as a visiting nurse in the slums of East Side, while her husband worked as an architect and a house painter. Hold on. Okay, this is getting to where I wanted to read. Some countries in northwestern Europe had more liberal policies towards contraception than the United States at the time. And when Sanger visited a Dutch birth control clinic in 1915, she learned about diaphragms and became convinced that they were more effective means of contraception than the suppositories and douches that she had been distributing back in the United States. Diaphragms were generally unavailable in the United States, so Sanger and others began importing them from Europe in defiance of United States laws. On October 16, 1916, Sanger opened a family planning and birth control clinic at 46 Amboy Street in Brownsville, neighborhood of Brooklyn, the first of its kind in the United States. 9 days after the clinic opened, Sanger was arrested. Sanger's bail was at $500 and she was sent back home. Sanger continued seeing more women in the clinic until the police came a second time. This time, Sanger and her sister, Ethel Byrne, were arrested for breaking a New York state law that prohibited distribution of contraceptives. Sanger was also charged with running a public nuisance. Sanger and Byrne went to trial in January 1917. Byrne was convicted and sentenced to 30 days in a workhouse but went on a hunger strike. She was force-fed, the first woman hunger striker in the U.S. to be so treated. Only when Sanger pledged that Byrne never break the law, she was pardoned after 10 days. Sanger was convicted. The trial judge held that women did not have, quote, the right to copulate with a feeling of security that there will be no resulting conception, end quote. What the heck? Sanger was offered a more lenient sentence if she was promised not to break the law again, but she replied, quote, I cannot respect the law as it exists today. For this, she was sentenced to 30 days in a workhouse. An initial appeal was rejected, but in a subsequent court proceeded in 1918. The birth control movement won a victory when Judge Frederick E. Crane of the New York Court of Appeals issued a ruling which allowed doctors to prescribe contraception. The publicly surrounding Sanger The publicity surrounding Sanger's arrest trial and appeals sparked birth control activism across the United States and earned support of numerous donors who would provide her funding and support for future endeavors. In February 19th, in February 1917, Sanger began publishing a monthly periodical birth control review. After World War I, Sanger shifted away from radical politics and she founded the American Birth Control League in 1921 to enlarge her base of supporters to include the middle class. The founding principles of the ABCL were as follows: we hold that children should be 1. Conceived in love, 2. Born of mother's conscious desire, 3. And only begotten under conditions which render possible the heritage of health. Therefore, we hold that every woman must possess the power and freedom to prevent contraception except when those conditions can be satisfied. Now, I think 3 obviously sounds suspicious, but the top 2 don't really sound sketchy, right? Um, Obviously, in the political landscape where Planned Parenthood was at, um, it was pretty unavoidable to not be a little. It's very sad, actually. Anyways, after Sanger's appeal of her conviction for the Brownsville Clinic secured a 1918 court ruling that exempted physicians from the law prohibiting the distribution of contraceptive information to women, provided it was prescribed for medical reason. She established the Clinical Research Bureau in 1923 to exploit this loophole. The CRB was first legal birth clinic control clinic in the United States, staffed entirely by female doctors and social workers. The clinic received extensive funding from John D. Rockefeller Jr. and his family, who continued to make anonymous donations to Sanger's causes in subsequent decades. Oh. Yeah, I guess I gotta read this part. Sanger invested a great deal of effort communicating with the general public. From 1969 onward, she frequently lectured in churches, women's clubs, homes, and theaters to workers, churchmen, liberals, socialists, scientists, and upper-class women. She once lectured on birth control to the Women's Auxiliary of the Ku Klux Klan in Silver Lake, New Jersey. In her autobiography, she justified her decision to address them by writing, quote, "Always to me any aroused group was a good group," meaning that she was willing to seek common ground with anyone who might help promote legalization and awareness of birth control. She described the experience as weird and reported that she had the impression that the audience were all half-wits and therefore spoke to them in simplest possible language as if she were talking to children. Well, that's a bit much. She wrote several books in the 1920s which had a nationwide impact on promoting the cause of birth control. Between 1920 and 1926, over 500,000 copies of Woman in the New Race and the Pivot of Civilization were sold. She also wrote 2 autobiographies designed to promote the cause. My Fight for Birth Control was published in 1931, and the second, more promotional version, Margaret Sanger, an autobiography, was published in 1937. Work with the African American community. Sanger worked with African American leaders and professionals who saw a need for birth control in their communities. In 1929, Harmon H. Hubert, a black social worker and the leader of New York's urban leader, asked Sanger to open a clinic in Harlem. Sanger secured funding from the Julius Rosenwald Fund and opened the clinic, staffed with black doctors in 1930. The clinic was directed by a 15-member advisory board consisting of black doctors, nurses, clergy, journalists, and social workers. The clinic was publicized in the African American press as well as in black churches, and it received the approval of Webb Du Bois, the co-founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. any editor of its magazine, The Crisis. Sanger did not tolerate bigotry among her staff, nor would she tolerate any refusal to work within anti racial projects. Sanger's work with minorities earned praise from Coretta and Martin Luther King Jr. when he was not able to attend his Margaret Sanger Award ceremony. In May 1966, Mr. King, read her husband's oh, read her husband's speech that praised Sanger, but first said her own words, quote, "Because of Sanger's dedication, her deep convictions, and for her suffering for what she believed in, I would like to say that I am proud to be a woman tonight." From 1939 to 1942, Sanger was an honorably delegate of Birth Control Federation of America, which included a supervisory role alongside Mary Lasker and Clarence Gamble in the Negro Project, an effort to deliver information about birth control to poor black people. Sanger advised Dr. Gamble on the utility of hiring a black physician for the Negro Project. She also advised him on the importance of reaching out to black ministers, writing, quote, the minister's work is also important, and also he should be trained, perhaps by the Birth Control Federation of America, as to our ideals and the goals that we hope to reach. We do not want word to get out that we want to exterminate the Negro population, and the minister is the man who can straighten out that idea, even ever occur. Hold on. And the minister is the man who can straighten out that idea if it ever occurs to any of their more rebellious members. Okay. Okay. Sexuality. While researching information on contraception, Sanger read treatises on sexuality, including The Psychology of Sex by English psychologist Havelock Ellis, and was heavily influenced by it. While traveling in Europe in 1914, Sanger met Ellis. Influenced by Ellis, Sanger adopted his views of sexuality as a powerful, liberating force. This view provided another argument in favor of birth control, because it would enable women to fully enjoy sexual relations without fear of unwanted pregnancy. Sanger also believed that sexuality, along with birth control, should be discussed with more candor, and praised Ellis for his effort in this direction. She also blamed Christianity for the suppression of such discussions. Oh. Freedom of speech. Sanger opposed censorship throughout her career. Sanger grew up in a home where orator Ingersoll was admired. During the earlier years of her activism, Sanger viewed birth control primarily as free speech issue rather as a feminist issue. When she started publishing The Woman Rebel in 1914, she did so with the express goal of provoking a legal challenge to the Comstock laws banning dissemination of information about contraception. In New York, Emma Goldman introduced Sanger to the members of the Free Speech League, such as Edward Bliss Foote and Theodore Schroeder, and subsequently the League provided funding and advice to help Sanger with legal battles. Over the course of her career, Sanger was arrested at least 8 times for expressing her views during an era in which speaking publicly about contraception was illegal. Numerous times in her career, local government officials prevented Sanger from speaking by shutting a facility or threatening her hosts. In Boston in 1929, city officials under the leadership of James Curley threatened to arrest her if she spoke. In response, she stood on stage silent, with a gag bag over her mouth while her speech was read by Martin S. Schleisinger, Sir. Okay. Oof. Eugenics. After World War I, Sanger increasingly posited a societal need to limit births by those least able to afford children. The affluent and educated already limited their childbearing, while the poor and uneducated lacked access to contraception and information about birth control. Here, she found an area of overlap with eugenicists. She believed that they both sought to, quote, assist the race toward the elimination of the unfit. She distinguished herself from other eugenicists by writing, quote, eugenicists imply or insist that a woman's first duty is to the state. We contend that her duty is to herself is the duty to the state. We maintain that a woman possessing an adequate knowledge of her reproductive function is the best judge of the time and conditions under which her child should be brought into the world. We further maintain that it is her right, regardless of all other considerations, to determine whether she shall bear children or not, and how many children she shall bear if she chooses to become a mother. Sanger was a proponent of negative eugenics, which aimed to improve human hereditary traits through social interventions by reducing the reproduction of those who were considered unfit. Um, Also, I think I mentioned this already, but in the pivot of civilization, this also implies that she implied that she doesn't want the majority race or what is considered the superior or whatever the rich people. She doesn't want them to have more kids either. So this isn't like this isn't like a, a competition actually, which is interesting, even despite the rhetoric I'm going to read later. Alright. Sanger's views of eugenics was influenced by Havelock, Ellis, and other British eugenicists, including H.G. Wells, with whom she formed a close, lasting friendship. She did not speak specifically to the she did not speak specifically to the idea of race or ethnicity being determined factors in, quote, although Sanger articulated birth control in terms of racial betterment, and, like most old stock Americans, supported restricted immigration, she always defined fitness in individual rather than racial terms, end quote. Instead, she stressed limiting the number of births to within one economic ability to raise the supported healthy children. This would lead to a betterment of society and the human race. Sanger's view put her at odds with leading American eugenicists such as Charles Davenport, who took a racist view of inherited traits. In A History of Birth Control Movement in America, Engelman also noted that Sanger, quote, effortlessly looked the other way when others spouted racist speech. She had no reservations about relying on flawed and overtly racist works to serve her own propaganda needs. Sanger was supported by one of the most racist authors in America in the 1920s, Klansman Lothrop Stoddard, who was a founding member of the board of directors of Sanger's American Birth Control League. Biographer Ellen Chesler commented, quote, Margaret Sanger was never herself a racist, but she lived in a profoundly bigoted society, and her failure to repudiate prejudice unequivocally, especially when it was manifested among proponents of her cause, has haunted her ever since. In, quote, The Mortality of Birth Control, a 1921 speech, she divided society into three groups: the educated and informed class that regulated the size of their families, the intelligent and responsible who desired to control their families in spite of lacking the means of the knowledge, and the irresponsible and reckless people whose religious scruples, quote, prevent their exercising control of their numbers. Sanger concludes there is no doubt in mind of all thinking people that the procreation of this group should be stopped. Sanger's eugenics policies included an exclusionary immigration policy, free access to birth control methods, and full family planning autonomy for the able-minded, as well as compulsory segregation and sterilization for the profoundly retarded. Sanger wrote, oh, quote, we do not believe that the community should send to the lethal chamber the defective pregnancy. Wait. Oh, resulting from irresponsible and unintelligent breeding. In The Pivot of Civilization, she criticized certain charity organizations for providing free obstetric and immediate post-birth care to indignant women without providing information about birth control, nor any assistance in raising or educating the children. By such charity, she wrote, quote, the poor woman is taught how to have her seventh child, when what she wants to know is how to avoid bringing into the world her eighth. Okay, I could have sworn there were some better faith interpretations of what she had to say. It sounds pretty bad. Again, I'll get to it. In personal correspondence, she expressed her sadness about the aggressive and lethal Nazi eugenics program and donated to the American Council Against Nazi Propaganda. Sanger believed that self-determining motherhood was the only unshakable foundation for racial betterment. Initially, she advocated that the responsibility for birth control should remain with able-minded individual parents rather than the state. Later, she proposed that, quote, permits for parenthood shall be issued upon application by city, county, or state authorities to married couples, but added that the requirement should be implemented by state advocacy and reward for complying, not enforced by punishing anyone for violating it. So that's, I don't know how you do that. Like, all those people, you would have to either have a vote on it, which I guess we do now, which we just get our rates taken away. But yeah, back then I just don't see it working that well. Anyways, just doing some research on some Havelock Ellis. Alright. Havelock Ellis was an English physician, eugenicist, writer, progressive intellectual, and social reformer who studied human sexuality. He co-wrote the first medical textbook in English on homosexuality in 1897, and also published works on a variety of sexual practices and inclinations, as well on transgender psychology. He is credited with introducing the notions of narcissism and autoeroticism, later adopted by psychoanalysis. Ellis was among the pioneering investigators of psychedelic drugs and the author of one of the first written reports to the public about an experience with mescaline, which he conducted on himself in 1896. He supported eugenics and served as one of the 16 vice presidents of the Eugenics Society from 1909 to 1912. Hold on. I thought this was interesting in terms of the connection. In November, in terms of the marriage here and such, in November 1891, at the age of 32 and reportedly still a virgin, Ellis married the English writer and proponent of women's rights Edith Lees. From the beginning, the marriage was unconventional, as Edith Lees was openly bisexual. At the end of the honeymoon, Ellis went back to his bachelor's room in Paddington. She lived at Fellowship House. There, quote, open marriage was the central subject in Ellis' autobiography, My Life. Ellis reportedly had an affair with Margaret Sanger. According to Ellis in My Life, his friends were much amused at his being considered an expert on sex. Some knew that he reportedly suffered from impotence until the age of 60. He then discovered that he could become aroused by the sight of a woman. Okay, weird. Okay. Ellis named this undinism after his wife died. Ellis formed a relationship with a French woman, Francois Lafayette. Alright. Eugenics. Ellis was a supporter of eugenics. He served as vice president of the Eugenics Education Society and wrote on the subject, among others, in The Task of Social Hygiene. Eventually, it seems evident a general system, whether private or public, whereby all personal facts, biological and mental, normal, and morbid, are duly and systematically registered, must become inevitable if we are to have a real guide as to those persons who are most fit or most unfit to carry on the race. The superficially sympathetic man flings a coin to the beggar. The more deeply sympathetic man builds an almshouse for him, so he need no longer beg. But perhaps the most radically sympathetic of all is the man who arranges that the beggar shall not be born. Oh, well, alrighty then. Um, Hold on. I was trying to get to something. Whoa. Um, hmm. Alright. That's a bit strange. Alright. So, I mostly wanted to scan over the connections with Havelock, Ellis, and Margaret Sanger. And yeah, I didn't actually know that she was influenced by him. That's interesting. Alright. Alright. So, in this article is a newsletter from spring 20, oh, 2000. Wow. The King and I. Sanger remembers Havelock Ellis. Margaret Sanger describes him as Olympian on more than one occasion and referred to him as the King only slightly in jest. Cerebral, withdrawn Henry Havelock Ellis, more likely to be seen sunning his long, thin frame on his garden lawn than exerting his influence in any public sphere, was to Margaret Sanger and many feminists, the sex reformers in the early 2000s century, a heroic presence. His writings on human sexuality eclipsed Freud's work in pre-World War I America and helped rouse a generation of women to fight for sexual autonomy. Ellis's 6-volume studies in psychology of sex, published between 1897 and 1928 and widely publicized as a result of censorship battles in England, challenged accepted models of sexual conduct and even the institution of marriage, while advocating non-procreating sex as natural and healthy human function. Ellis securely linked women's sexual liberation and pleasure to social stability, a belief that Sanger heralded and an equation that she recognized would necessarily require birth control. Hold on, there was a reason and something I really wanted to get to here. I probably should have paid attention to what I wanted to read on here. I do believe that Havelock Ellis didn't really think homosexuals needed to be sterilized. And this isn't in good faith. It's just he didn't think it was necessary. Yeah. Okay. Oh, okay. Alright. In his earlier writings, this is Havelock Ellis again, if you weren't paying attention, if you're just listening in. In his earlier writings, it was clear that Ellis conjured with the notion that there was a system of racial hierarchies and that non Western cultures were considered to be lowered races Before explicitly talking about eugenic topics, he used the prevalence of homosexuality in these lower races to indicate the universality of the behavior. In his work, Sexual Inversions, where Ellis presented numerous cases of homosexuality in Britain, he was always careful to mention the race of the subject and the health of the person's stock, which included their neuropathic conditions and the health of their patients. However, Ellis was clear to assert that he did not feel that homosexuality was an issue that eugenics needed to actively deal with, as he felt that once the practice was accepted in society, those with homosexual tendencies would comfortably choose not to marry and thus would cease to pass the homosexuality heredity along. Um, yeah. So it's not in good faith, it's just he thinks it would just die out in general. So if it wasn't for that, sterilization would probably be on the table. Alright. I don't know if I want to read this now because I don't know how much time I have left on the screen capture. So I will save this for another video.